Hello, my little sinners and saints. Tonight we're going to do the Kansas City Butcher. Let me tell you right now, I have tried to fix this a lot. I need to get my one lights up, but I need to fix it because I had to close the windows, everything else, and it's still like shining in on me and everything else. So if I turn sideways, you can kind of see my nose and face. I do have one, I have a nose. But anyway, um, we're going to go ahead and start. This should be fun. And I will see you soon. We're going to do something else here. So, okay, sorry that was a little long. Okay, we're going to leave it here just for a little bit because I have a lot of reading. Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. was born on January 29th, 1949. He died October 8th, 1992. Obviously, he would died in prison, but we'll get to that. He was an American serial killer who kidnapped, raped, tortured, and murdered at least 6 young men after having forced his victim to endure periods of up to 6 weeks, of captivity. His crimes took place in Kansas City, Missouri between 1984 and 1987. describing his murders as being some of his darkest fantasies becoming my reality, unquote. Those were quotations. Robert pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, without the possibility of parole, for first degree murder of one of his victims, Larry Pearson, in 1988 of August, and would later plead guilty to one further charge of first degree murder and four charges of second degree murder in December of 1988. He died from a heart attack while he was incarcerated in Missouri State Penitentiary in October of 1992. Robert became, it says Bordella, but I'm afraid I'm going to end up messing that up. So I'm going to go back in between Robert and Bordella. So um, Bordella was became known as a Kansas City butcher due to his practice of extensive dissecting of victims' bodies, which he would dispose of in garbage bags, and the collector, which he's also known by, and something else, um, due both to the movie, which he stated was the basis for of his fantasies behind the modus operandi of his crimes, and much of the evidence subsequently uncovered by investigations. Okay, and we're going to go over again here. Robert was born January 31st, 1949, in Cuyahoga Falls, Iowa. He was the firstborn of two sons, Robert Andrew Bordella Sr., um, a die setter for the Ford Motor Company, and Mary Louise, she was Huffman Bordella. Robert's father was a devout Roman Catholic of Italian descent. The family regularly attended Mass, and both sons attended educational courses. As a child, Robert was intelligent, but a loner who rarely played outside his home and seldom had friends visit to socialize. He had a speech impediment and wore thick glasses from the age of 5 because he was severely nearsighted. He was diagnosed with high blood pressure, for which he took several medications. Robert was largely unathletic, whereas his younger brother, Daniel, 7 years his junior, displayed an aptitude for various sports from an early age. As Robert's father valued sports and physical education, he viewed his older brother's lack of interest in sports as a sign of failure, and often compared him unfavorably to his younger brother. Occasionally, Robert's father physically and emotionally abused the children and beat them with a leather strap. Okay, we're going to move on up to the adolescent. We'll read a little bit there and then we'll move on. Um, I do want to say that when Robert reached puberty, he discovered that he was a homosexual. Initially, he had kept it in a closet as a guarded secret, and then he became open about it for several years. Nonetheless, his early teenage years, he had a girlfriend, and he became more open about his sexuality when he was in college. Adolescent. By his mid-teen years, Robert had begun to display a degree of self-confidence, becoming rude and condescending to others, particularly women. He learned about cooking. Sorry, I got a touch screen. I was trying to make it bigger because my old ass can't see. He learned about cooking and he became a chef. He was really good at being a chef too, like really good. And but he also had a little side hustle. Let me get my glasses on. He learned about cooking and the art of developing showmanship. On Christmas Day, 1965, the Bordella family drove to Canton, Ohio to visit relatives. That evening, Robert's father had a heart attack at the age of 39. 2 days later, Bordella returned to Cuyahoga Falls by himself. When he arrived, his family told him that his father died. Um, Robert saw solace in the Catholicism and later read extensively as many faiths, but eventually became cynical about all religion. In 1965, Robert saw the film adaptation of John Fowles' novel, The Collector. I don't think that's The Bone Collector, which I've seen that one, so that it's just The Collector. I'm gonna have to go watch it. Um, the pilot of the film revolves around a disturbed man who stalks and then abduction women whom he finds attractive, holding her captive in his windowless stone basement and viewing her as little more than an attractive specimen. After several weeks, the woman dies of a contracted illness despite her captor's efforts to keep her alive. Robert later stated this movie had formed a lasting impression on him. Shortly after the death of Robert's father, his mother remarried, an action which was met with resentment by Robert, who viewed that the family had moved on and kind of left him behind. It was a betrayal of his father. Um, as a result, he became increasingly withdrawn, further immersed himself in the solitary activities he had participated in as childhood, such as painting, collecting coins and stamps, and writing to foreign pen pals. Robert would later claim that his hobby of writing to pen pals in other countries, such as Vietnam and Burma, um, and the fact that the pen pals would send him stamps from their collection and photographs of mythical and historical icons, ancient cultures, and architectural would lead to him developing an interest in primitive art, photographs, and antiques. He was really good with antiques too. He could like spot them. From approximately 1965, he would begin avidly collecting these artifacts. This practice would later inspire him to open his own antique business. And oh, what a name. The antique business was good. It wasn't that. It wasn't like he used it to get victims or anything. Um, but it was just the name of it. Relocation to Kansas City, his college years. And I feel like that we need to know all this information because it kind of fills in the actual incidents. Because if you hear the incidents, you kind of want a little backstory to it too. Trust me, I stayed at a Holiday Inn. His college years. In the summer of 1967, Robert graduated from Cuyahoga Falls High School. Throughout his studies in high school, he had earned such excellent grades and displayed such potential that in 1966, one teacher had placed him in an independent study program. Shortly after graduation, Robert relocated to Kansas City. There he would enroll in the Kansas City Art Institute, KCAI. Woohoo! With aspirations of becoming a college professor. In his first years at KCAI, Robert was considered an attentive and talented student. Although by his second year, Robert became vocally anti-authoritarian, um, and some of the research that I found too, that he was really doing well when he first started, and then the teacher like had to start doing something because his art projects were getting so like wild. They involve live animals and stuff. So hold on, I gotta take a drink. Okay. He also became acquainted with a clique of students who supplied him with drugs. And in other stories, you're not going to hear about him doing drugs, but he does drugs. Acquainted with students who supplied him with drugs, which he then sold to other students at a profit. In addition, he became regularly using alcoholic and abusing it. He also engaged in activities of animal torture on at least two occasions. During these incidents, he decapitated a duck. He decapitated a duck. Oh my. I say this because he also eats the duck. So it's like he really didn't torture the animal. He just cut its head off and eat it. He decapitated a duck. I had to come back on screen for this. I mean, come on. You can't make this shit up. You can't make it up, people. He decapitated a duck, I'm sorry, in the presence of his peers. Maybe that's what made it, maybe it was at school or something. I don't know. In the second instance, he experimented with sedatives and tranquilizers on the dog. Oh, Lord. Jesus save me. At the age of 19, Robert was arrested for attempting to sell defending to an undercover officer. He was released after posting a $3,000 bond, which is equivalent to about 25,600 today in 2023. As of June 13th, let me just say June 12th was a letdown. But and he would later plead guilty to the offense and was handed a 5-year suspended sentence. 1 month later, he was arrested again. Robert and two students were arrested for the possession of the devil's lettuce and LSD in Johnson County. On this occasion, Robert could not post bond. He spent 5 days in jail, although the charges against him and one of the other students was dropped to lack of evidence. In 1969, Robert voluntarily withdrew from KCAI after receiving harsh criticism from college administrators for killing and cooking a duck for the sake of art. Oh, okay. He did it there at school. Okay. There's so many jokes running through my head right now. I've got a very dark sense of humor. That's why I try to keep it bottled up inside. Okay, by this stage, Robert was openly gay for several years. He began spending much of his free time with male prostitutes, drug addicts, and petty criminals and runaways. Robert was typically befriended by these types of individuals. Then he would try to help them with their drug addictions and criminal lifestyles, although he was adamant that throughout much of the 1970s, he had no physical contact whatsoever with any of them. Okay, he was going to help this. Just know that he was a pillar in society. Like people thought he was a really good citizen. He was A1, and he was not. Um, he on the outside, it looked like he's a good citizen and all that. So, but on the inside of his house, he was killing people. He says he's helping with drug addictions. Well, you'll learn later on that he's actually supplying these people. What you'll learn, you'll learn, you'll learn. You'll stay at a Holiday Inn too. It's good. Okay, 4315 Charlotte Street. And I'm going to read this because I feel like seeing how they put a street number out there that this is probably important. In 1969, Robert voluntarily withdrew. Okay, got that. To several of his neighbors, Robert stated he gradually almost felt like a foster parent to many of these youths. I'm sorry, it's funny because he's portraying this I'm a goody two shoes and I am just this wonderful person saving people. And he's not. By the early 1980s, many of his older acquaintances had ceased any form of social contact with him, with Robert increasingly relying on these young men as a source of companionship and friendship. He would later claim to have become increasingly frustrated that many of the individuals were ignorant of his efforts to steer them away from their self destructive behavior. Despite the later claims of investigators, Robert would often engage in sexual relationships with these men that he had befriended and would establish a degree of control over them, in part to engage in sexual relations via methods of loaning them money or allowing them to live rent free at his house for periods of time. To his neighbor, Robert was considered a flamboyant yet helpful, civic minded, despite the general unkempt state of his property and somewhat haughty attitude. Okay, at first he was like super clean, super, you know, everything was clean and spotless and everything like that. And then by the time that he got caught, it was a horrible mess. We'll see pictures. We'll see pictures. But it was bad. He didn't stay at home anymore. What the fuck is wrong with these people? Okay, shortly before, oh, and he owned his own house too. I don't know if it mentions it in here. Shortly before Robert moved into Charlotte Street address, that's the one. That's why it's mentioned, is because this is the house where everything goes down. And he actually owned this house. And so I'm saying he portrayed himself to be this good citizen, and he kind of backed it up for the outside. He began working as a short order cook in various restaurants around Kansas City. In part, he would pay. This was to help pay the lawyer fees that he had incurred from previous drug arrests. As a means of obtaining additional income, he also sold items of art and antiques he had incurred and collected from contacts he established in Africa, Asia, South America, and various Pacific Rim countries. He initially he initially operated the side business from his home. Both Robert's career and his side business eventually flourished, and by the mid 1970s, he began working as a senior cook at several renowned Kansas City restaurants, also joining local chefs association and helping establish a training program for aspiring chefs in the community college. Simultaneously, he began to devote his attention to his own business as opposed to his work as a chef. By 1981, he had established several contractual agreements with both national and international contacts for his own antique business. He viewed this business as a full time job and later ceased working as a chef. He also, it doesn't say in here, but he also done some sort of type of mentoring or counseling or something for youth. But yeah, youth. I gotta take a drink. I'll have a sore throat. Okay, by 1982, Robert had begun renting his own booth at Westport Flea Market. Oh, I love the flea market. This store was named Bob's Bazaar, spelled differently, and primarily sold and traded primitive art, jewelry, and antiques. Although occasionally making generous monthly profit, the income he typically generated via the business was often not sufficient to maintain his daily expenses and make ends meet. As a result, Robert would occasionally steal or scavenge from items from others to sell at his booth and take in lodgers at his home as a means of gaining additional income. At his work premises, Robert became acquainted with a fellow merchant named Paul Howell, who operated a booth adjacent to his own. Soon, Robert became acquainted with Paul Howell's younger son, Jerry. Initially, Jerry Howell and his friends scathed and taunted Robert over his homosexuality, although, according to Robert, Jerry Howell later confided in him that him and his friends occasionally earn money by being male prostitutes. In the early 1980s, Paul Howell had relocated his business to a store close to the intersection of 39th and Main. His family, his family had also moved into an apartment above the shop. Robert remained a casual friend of the family, also, also offering his assistance if Jerry encountered any minor scrapes with the law. By the summer of 1984, Jerry Howe had turned 19. Let me see if I've got any extra notes I want to read before we get into the murder victims. He's categorized as names the collector. He's sexual sadism, possession, and control. I don't want to read that yet. Like I said, he was known as an upstanding citizen. He came from a traditional nuclear family. Um, he did feel isolation from his peers, claims that he was, this ain't in there, claims that he was raped at a restaurant where he worked as an adolescent, but he never reported it to cops, which I'm not saying anything about that, about him not reporting it. I just, to be noted. Started using drugs. He's quit school because the teachers didn't um, understand his twisted art projects, which often involve, like I said, live animals. He bought his own house. He was a very good chef. He was very good at arts, antiques, and connoisseur, and he had great taste. Dun, 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 dun. I think the rest of this is going to be what we're getting into. Okay, the murders. Dun dun dun. Okay, Robert Robert is believed to have killed his first victim on July 5th, 1984. Let me say before we go any further into this, there is warnings and triggers and all that good stuff. Um, there are some pictures in here and they are alive. That's what I'm assuming. And but it shows some pictures. He had 344 pictures, Polaroids of guys, and he would document very meticulously the way that you'll see. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm getting ahead of myself, people. But Robert is believed to have killed his first victim on July 5th, 1984. His first known victim was 19-year-old Jerry Howell. Robert had promised to drive the youth to attend a dancing contest in Maram. I've had trouble with this in Maram. We'll say the big M. According to Robert, he piled Hal with alcohol, diazepam. That is how I know how to say that. And prozine, both in his car and at his house until the youth became unconscious. He then injected Hal with heavy tranquilizers before binding him to his bed. Hal was restrained to Robert's bed for a period of approximately 28 hours. Throughout this period of captivity, Robert repeatedly drugged, tortured, raped, and violated him with foreign objects, reportedly ignoring Hal's intermediate questioning as to why he was being treated in this manner and his pleas to be freed before. According to Robert, Jerry either asphyxiated on his own vomit or a combination of the gag, like he was puking and then they had the gag in, and the medications that he given were too strong. Anyway, he couldn't catch his breath and he died. Robert would later state that he briefly attempted to perform CPR upon Hal. Don't believe that. After having after he had died before dragging his body to the basement. No, not on drugs. He was suspended. He suspended Howell above a large cooking pot and made several incisions in the youth's inner elbows and jugular vein before leaving him suspended that in that position overnight to allow the blood to drain into from the corpse. The day following, he dismembered Howell's body using a chainsaw and boning knives before wrapping the sections of into newspaper and then putting in trash bags. These bags were later placed into other trash bags, which Robert would place outside in the garbage for the crew to collect and take to the landfill the next day. Also, he's got a plan. He has to do it on trash day. Got it. Later questioned by officers investigating Hal's disappearance, Robert claimed that he had driven. Yeah, he was actually investigated about this because he was the last one that had seen him. He had driven the youth to the Big M as promised, and that the two later parted company close to Hal's intended destination. Robert further claimed that he had not seen him since. As would be in the case of Robert's murders, he kept detailed log in which he documented each sexual and physical torture inflicted um, upon the victim. Robert would recall that it's like a subsequent victims he would hold captive, like the like those. How repeatedly pleaded for his ongoing abuse torture to cease throughout this period of his capture. Although Robert would either ignore his pleas, taunt his victim, or threaten his victim, he would remain adamant to investigators that he would not get any enjoyment for this, but what he termed his physical and mental satisfaction would be his enjoyment. Okay, I'm going to try to get through all of the killings because I kind of want you to know. I might just kind of glance over some of them, but there was six in total, and then one got away. But he would hook, oh God, some kind of clips up to him. He would bring in uh, something like a generator. I can't think of it right now, and I know it on it's on the tip of my tongue. It starts with a T. Um, but he would bring it in. He would shock them. He'd bring in batteries to hook up. He would. I've got to read some of this. Yuns ain't gonna believe it. This was his house. Whenever the cops went into it, and we'll stop there for a minute. On April 1985, a itinerant former lodger, 20-year-old Robert Shelton arrived at Robert's doorstep, asking him if he could stay at the house for a short period of time. According to Robert, although Shelton was responsible for paying rent, he considered him an inconvenience. And although he was not physically attracted to the victim, he chose to drug him and hold him captive. On April 12th, when he returned from home from work to find Sheldon intoxicated in his home, Robert was adamant he held no firm malice towards Sheldon, that he saw him as someone upon whom he could express some of his anger and frustration that I had towards him and other people. That's his quote, not mine. Sheldon drugged them with sedatives, held him captive on the second floor for 3 days. He also keeps a note of how long they lived. Um, for 3 days, enduring forms of torture such as swabbing of drain cleaner in his left eye. He would take drain cleaner and put in his left eye. He would insert needles beneath his fingertips. Oh, that's always a good one. Then binding his wrist with piano wire with the intention of permanently damaging the nerves in his hands and filling his eyes or his ears with caulking to reduce his hearing capacity. 3 days after Robert had begun holding Sheldon captive on April 15th, A workman came to perform some scheduled work on the roof of Robert's home. So Robert chose to fatally suffocate Sheldon by placing a sack over his head, which he tightened with a piece of rope, and he later dissected Shelton's body on the third floor. He took it down to the basement while that guy was there, and then he brought it back. The following June, Robert found Mark Wallace, whom he vaguely knew via Wallace having previous helped him with yard work, hiding in his tool shed to seek shelter from the severe thunderstorm. As been the case with Robert Shelton, Robert invited him into his house and, noting Wallace's acute state of tenseness and depression, volunteered to inject him with some chlorrazepine, which the explanation of this would calm him down and relax him. Wallace agreed to it. 30 minutes later, he was a captive. Wallace was carried to the second floor bedroom where he endured almost a day of captivity and torture, including the application of alligator clips to his nipples to facilitate electrical shocks to his body at the point which Wallace began recessing into the state of unconsciousness. According to Robert, 1 hour of this experimenting with hypodermic needles by inserting them into various muscles upon his victim's back, Mark Wallace died through a combination of the drugs, the gag, and a lack of oxygen. He noted that the victim's death as being at 7 p.m. on June 23rd. Okay, the next victim is going to be James Ferris. Pretty much, he needed somewhere to live. He drugs him. He gets him drugged. He crushed his tranquilizers that he had concealed in his meal. He tied him up to his bed before torturing him um, almost constantly for about approximately, almost consistently for approximately 27 hours. The torture included repeated administering 7,700-volt electrical shocks to the shoulders and testicles for up to 5 minutes in each instance, and acupuncture via hypodermic needles to the neck and genitals. Ferris gradually became delirious, but Robert continued the physical and sexual assaults until he noted in his log that Ferris was unable to sit up for 10 to 15 seconds. The next entry read, very delayed breathing, and finally, Robert noted that Ferris died with a slang term he had used in his career as a chef, which Robert later explained meant anything from throw it out to stop the project. Next one is Todd Stoops, 23. He had lived with Robert before, and him and his wife had got into a fight, so he was going to see if he could live with Robert. He met him somewhere, like, just out at the store, a chance encounter. Robert would later stress to investigators that he was extremely physical with Stoops, and he was also attracted to him. And this victim was held captive for 2 days or 2 weeks before he died, which gave him gradually increasing his captive's terror to make him a cooperative and incapacitative sex slave. That's what he was wanting. He was like the Dahmer thing. He just did it different. Robert used electrical shocks through Stoops' eyes. His eyes were closed in an attempt to blind him and inject drain cleaner into his larynx to keep him silenced from screaming. During the next 2 weeks, his captor Stoops asked Robert for a soft drink and a sandwich, in which he refused. Stoops burst into tears. On June 27th, he ruptured Stoops' anal wall with his fist, causing bleeding and discharge. Towards the ends of Stoops' captivity, he tried to feed him ice cream and soup, although he wasn't able to keep anything down. By the final day of captivity, Stoops was so weak that Robert later stated that he was unable to breathe in the sitting position. On July 1st, 1986, Stoops died. A forensic pathologist later testified that the ruptured anal wall was caused septic shock and was the reason for his death. And then we have Larry Wayne Pearson, 1987. He was a casual friend of Pearson's. He encountered him at his shop. So I guess I need to correct that. Pearson was into witchcraft and wizardry and things like that. So he temporarily stayed with Robert. Of course, paying rent. On the afternoon of June 23rd, Robert and Pearson watched the movie Creepshow 2, awesome, together before eating lunch. As the two drove around Kansas, the young men began jokingly referring to his practice of robbing gay men in Wichita. And this was Pearson that was saying that he would rob gay men in Wichita, Kansas. Because when you say Wichita, I think it's somewhere else. Anyway, the disclosure finalized Robert's decision to hold Pearson captive. The evening Robert ensured Pearson became intoxicated by injecting him with chlorazepam, it's chlorpromazine. I don't know how to say that. And moving him down to the basement where he bound Pearson's hands above his head, then linked a rope that he had used for another purpose, and then he used it to put around his neck and put him to the brick. I don't know brick column, before injecting Pearson's larynx with drain cleaner. I just think that would kill you. I don't understand how these people survive. He then brought electrical transformer. That's the word I was looking for, people. Transformer. Why didn't you help me out? Transformer to the basement. According to Robert, Pearson was far the most cooperative of the 6 victims. On the 5th day of his captivity, having by this stage endured torture such as repeated administration of electrical shocks with the transformer, and then breaking several of his hand bones with an iron rod and rendering him submissive, Robert deduced Pearson had earned his trust, and he continued his cooperation in sexual and physical abuse. So he cooperated the whole time, is what it's saying. Robert deduced, and he earned trust, and as a reward, he moved him to the 2nd floor. And as he continued to cooperate, he got him to let him put his hands in front of him instead of behind him or up in the air, wherever he had him at that time. Throughout the latter part of the 6 weeks, Pearson trained himself to sleep without moving in order that he did not antagonize Robert or invite further torture or being returned to the basement. After 6 weeks of captivity, Pearson deeply bit into Robert's penis before screaming he could not continue to tolerate his ongoing poor treatment. In response, Robert killed Pearson by first bludgeoning him unconscious with a tree limb, then suffocating him with a bag and ligature before driving to the hospital to receive treatment for his wound. Robert got a wound, so he had to go get treatment for it. Pearson's body was later dismembered in the basement, and his head was initially stored in a plastic bag in Robert's freezer before he buried it in the yard. Okay, we're down to the final victim, people. The final victim. At 1 o'clock on March 29, 1988, Robert abducted his last victim, a 22-year-old male prostitute, Christopher Bryson, whom he had lured to his house with the promise of payment of sex. At Robert's home, Bryson was knocked unconscious with the iron bar, then bound to Robert's bed with where he would be subjected to similar methods of abuse, of torture. This is the one that earns the trust to get the hands in front of him, not the last one. I apologize. That was my mistake. He subjected him to similar methods of abuse and torture endured by previous victims. Although in Bryson's case, Robert repeatedly swabbed his eyes with ammonia before exclaim, before exclaiming to him, "The only things that you need to think about are me in this house." After several days, Bordella explained to Bryson he had begun to trust him and he was willing to discuss aspects of the abuse and torture he was receiving. That was like a reward. He was going to talk about what he was doing to him. There would be no negotiating pertaining to the sexual abuse. Bordella finished his discussion with a stern warning. "I've gotten this far with other people before, and they're dead now because of the mistakes they made." By the third day of his capture, Bryson had earned sufficient trust from Bordella to persuade him to establish a daily regime of tying his hands in front of him after sexual abuse rather than above his head into the bed, upon the excuse that Robert's doing was restricting the circulation in his arms. What he was doing was restricting, circulation. He persuaded Robert to leave the television on in the room and the remote between his legs whenever he was out of the room. However, later on, state investigators thought he had thought almost constant about escaping. Oh, later on, they said that he had thought about escaping. The following day, he managed to break free from his restraints by burning through them with the book of matches that Robert had left inadvertently in the room and within his reach. And when he left the house to go to his place of work, Bryson managed to escape from the house by jumping from the second floor, wearing nothing but a dog collar around his neck. He broke a bone in his foot in the process of jumping out the window. He ran towards a meter reader walking across to the other side of the street, shouting for them to call the police. The meter reader led Bryson to the house where he was approaching, whereupon the occupants promptly called the police, who arrived minutes later. Questioned at the scene by four officers, Bryson was initially claimed he had been hitchhiking when abducted by Robert, who had kidnapped him, raped, and tortured him for 4 days, and he escaped by jumping out the window of the property. Robert had kept him bound on the second floor and sodomized him, drugged him, injected his throat with drain cleaner. He noticed that the dog collar, and they took him to the doctor at Minraw Medical Center. Two cops went with him. One cop stayed there, and then another cop called in to get a search warrant for the property. And so they were just watching for Robert to show up home. And Bryson also told the cops about he had Polaroids of pictures and detailed stuff. So they went in and they searched the house. We're going to read this. On the afternoon of Bryson's escape, Robert was arrested on the charges pertaining to sexual assault of Christopher Bryson. He declined to allow officers inside his home, and the search warrant earlier requested was drafted to search the property. Corroborating Bryson's claims of having been restrained and tortured in the second floor, investigators discovered in the bedroom on the second floor where they found burnt ropes attached to posts at the foot of the bed. Also, the room had an electrical transformer plugged into the wall and wires leading to the bed. A metal tray containing syringes, small bottles apparently containing prescription drugs, swabs, and eye drops that were close to the bed. Also found in the room was a long iron pipe, various lengths of rope, leather belts. Investigators also noted that the post of the bed had been extensively worn, suggesting the restraints had earlier been tied to these posts and the individual or individuals had struggled to free themselves. They found the human skull that was partially decomposing in the backyard. This is after he got messy. I think this was his bedroom. Was this his bedroom? Let me see. Warning, 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 warning. That's the decapitated head. I don't know what this is. To me, it looks like there's more there, but I don't know. I'm going through these fast. This is the man of the hour. This is a little news clipping of when he got arrested. Bob's Bizarre. Bizarre. This is a little notepad where he kept methodical details of what happened, when they died. Here's a blown up picture of it. Um, these people never cease to amaze me. They really don't. I don't know who the hell this guy is, but this was a picture of like the bags and stuff in his house. But this is him digging up the thing, again, a better, clearer picture there. And these are some of his papers because he wrote papers and shit on stuff. But when you have a Jeffrey Dahmer and a Ted Bundy that goes back to the bodies, or Edmund Kemper, and then you run across this guy and you're like, holy, there's people out there walking around like this. I had to throw that in because this is funny. The cat's had enough. They called him the butcher. Get it? Ah, I entertain myself. This is the house, I guess, then and now. This is the house then. This is one of the guys that tortured. He is alive. This is one of the guys that he took a Polaroid of in the chair. That was out of the movie. There's plenty of movies about this guy. I thought that was funny. It reminds me of Freddy. This is his grave. Subscribe, like, and share. Happy, happy, joy, joy. Thank y'all for watching. And as always, let me make sure there ain't nothing else. And as always, I appreciate you coming and listening to my babbles. And make sure there's nothing else that I want to tell you before you go. There's not. Yins are the best. And we will see. I'm telling you guys. Anyway, I will see you later. Thank you for coming. And as always, bye.